Romance is one of the most popular and profitable genres in publishing, but it also has specific reader expectations. My name is Zara Hoffman, and today I'm going to be talking about how to write one that readers will love. For a writer who has never written romance might wrongly assume that this is an easy genre and produce a shallow relationship and story. Or they're so focused on subverting romance tropes that they forget to deliver on what readers love about romance in the first place. The romance genre has two non-negotiables. Romance needs to be central to the romance novel. People need to feel like they've read a story about a relationship, not a story with a relationship in it. And if you write a story that has a relationship in it that doesn't end in a happily ever after or a happy for now, you have not written a romance, you've written a romantic plotline. While Romeo and Juliet is a love story, it is a tragedy of Shakespeare's rather than one of his romantic comedies. If a reader is going to pick up a romance, it's normally because they know that the characters are going to get together and that's what they expect. But if they get to the end of your book and that doesn't happen, they're going to feel cheated and wonder what the point of your book was. And these two rules are not as limiting as you might think. Think of them as parameters instead, and understand that the romance genre still offers incredible variety in subgenre, heat level, relationship dynamics, character types, and anything else that make a story unique by playing within the tropes and expectations, but making it your own. Now, for the rest of the video, I'm going to be talking about romance novels that have two characters in a relationship because that's what I've personally written and what Inimitable Books has published so. But feel free to extrapolate this out to polyamorous relationships you might be writing, or any other type of relationship that is not a monogamous heterosexual one like the ones I will be describing. Just be aware that if you are planning on writing a larger polyamorous family, that it can get a little bit overwhelming depending on the number of characters you have. A good romance requires all of the love interests to have complete arcs that intertwine with and support the relationship development that is happening over the course of the book. A personal flaw or wound to overcome, an arc that makes them ready for the relationship, and development that is necessary to make that relationship work for and earned happily ever after at the end. The romance needs to be central to your plot, which means it's central to your character's growth in some ways, but it should not be the only reason for them wanting to change. That reads as flat. And while love is a very powerful thing in real life and in fiction, it is not a cure-all, and you should not write it as one. Your characters need to grow as individuals while also growing as a couple. And something that some writers do is that they make a single character in the relationship do all the emotional labor, and we don't want that. But here's a good example. In Until the Last Page by Chantal Bedore, the main character, Josephine, starts the book unlucky in love after a broken engagement and is confronted with familiar fairy tales with unknown twists that force her to re-examine her thoughts on relationships and what it means to have a happily ever after. Prince Aneurin starts the book transformed into a frog and must find true love's kiss to break his spell, but he initially insists that it must be a princess because he's blinded to any other possibility. But by the end of the book, both characters have caught feelings and are forced to unlearn their original assumptions as their relationship develops over the course of their adventures through the pages of the enchanted fairy tale book. The best romances show why this relationship with this person at this time is what those characters need for their personal growth. This person specifically challenges them in ways they need to be challenged. This person grows in ways that they never have before in order to be a better partner in the relationship. The relationship should work because the characters have grown, not just in spite of their issues. You want to be writing a healthy relationship at the end of the day, unless you are writing dark romance, but I am not talking about that in this video because it is not a subgenre that I read. I will get into subgenres later, but for now, let's talk about conflicts that work in romance novels. For a romance novel to work, like any novel, you need to have conflict. Otherwise, it's going to be a very short story. And romance needs conflict to create tension. Effective conflicts in a romance novel create genuine obstacles to their relationship, require character growth to overcome, and can't be solved by a single conversation. You don't want to have manufactured misunderstandings that could be solved with one conversation, characters withholding information for no good reason, external obstacles with no emotional resonance, conflict that make the characters seem stupid or immature, and you don't want to have problems that appear and disappear at convenient moments. There are three types of conflicts for romance, although you could say that they exist in all novels. You have the internal and external external, which I've talked about before. And then you have the interpersonal, which is super important because romances focus much more on relationships between characters, not just the romantic ones, than other genres might. The strongest novels in general combine internal and external conflicts. External circumstances create pressure, and the internal growth that happens as a result is what allows the relationship to succeed in a romance novel. I gave different internal conflicts to my main characters in my debut novel, The Belgrave Legacy. The main male character, Caleb, eventually feels conflicted about lying to the main female character, Fawn, because he knows that he isn't who he is claiming to be. And she eventually feels unable to trust him when she learns that he was lying. These are real emotional blocks that stand in the way of the characters having their happily ever after too soon in the story. External circumstances are forces that obstruct your character's ability to be in a happy relationship together. Maybe it's physical distance, a reason they can't be together, like if you're writing a contemporary romance, there might be a no fraternizing at work rule, or perhaps doesn't want them together. It could be almost anything as long as it's reasonable within your story and isn't too easily resolved. In my second trilogy, Stellar Blood, I don't allow Verity and Knox to immediately become a couple because there are a lot of things they have to overcome. The first of which is that she meets him while she is a kidnapped captive on his alien spaceship. Now, he's not the one who kidnapped her, he never hurts her, but she isn't on board with his species' plan to essentially take over the Earth, and that's a big hurdle. Also, he isn't really allowed to be with the human because as the king of his kind, he needs to be with another alien. So those are both external problems that can't be wished away or resolved with a simple conversation. An interpersonal conflict, which is super important to romance novels, is when the love interests have a problem with the other. This isn't necessarily I don't like or even I hate them, but those two are absolutely valid starting positions and are the basis for rivals to lovers and enemies to lovers, respectively. For an interpersonal conflict, they can simply be in opposition to each other because their goals are competing. In the third book of my debut trilogy, Taming the Alpha has both love interests who are alphas of individual packs. But when they find out they're mates, the expectation is that the woman will give up her position to become the Luna of their merged pack. And Zelda's goal is to keep her position, while Dylan, her mate's goal is to merge their packs and be in a happy relationship with her. He wants to be with her. She's not totally sold on it. And you can see how because their goals aren't aligned, that would create friction for them to deal with over the course of the book. These three types of conflict work because they are backed up by substance. Your conflict needs to create genuine obstacles that require characters to grow in order to overcome. If the conflict goes away the moment the characters decide to put in any real effort, it wasn't a real conflict, it was a convenient plot device that weakens your story. And I've mentioned before that a manufactured misunderstanding is not a good type of conflict, especially if it's a simple problem that could be solved with an honest conversation between the love interest. There needs to be a reason that they are not having it. If there is an emergency and it gets postponed, okay, maybe that works. But you don't want to take that too far because readers will be screaming, just talk to each other, and will feel frustrated instead. Readers might tolerate a lot of conflict in a book, but it needs to feel real and earned. And they will hate minor conflict if it feels manufactured or if it makes the characters seem incompetent at basic communication. And I should note that whatever conflicts you put in your romance novel need to be proportional to the story length. A novel-length romance needs more substantial conflict than they're too shy to admit their feelings. Save that type of lighter conflict for a romance short story or novella, or make sure you have other heavier duty conflicts tied in and layered to justify the length of a novel. Chemistry gets characters together. Compatibility is what keeps them together. And romance needs both. In fiction and in real life, chemistry is sexual and or romantic tension. It's the spark, the pull, the heat. It's what makes readers want your characters to be together. It's often instinctive and immediate for your characters. And there is always a certain level of attraction or physical awareness unless your characters are demisexual or asexual. Compatibility is when the characters have shared values and life goals, ability to communicate and resolve conflict, because that is really attractive. They have complementary personalities and they have emotional and intellectual connection, not just physical unless you are writing erotica, in which case that's normally fine. And they need to have long-term potential. A lot of romances nail chemistry, but sometimes forget compatibility. Readers need to see why these two people would actually work in a long-term relationship, not just why they're initially attracted to each other. Chemistry is the easy part for a lot of writers. You describe the physical reactions, awareness, the desire, and that's great. You want to be showing them. You definitely don't want to be telling those things, you want to be showing them, because chemistry is visceral and immediate. But just like in real life, if all you have is chemistry, that's not enough to sustain a satisfying romance. People can have incredible chemistry and still be completely wrong for each other. Chemistry without compatibility is just infatuation. Just look at Romeo and Rosalind at the start of Romeo and Juliet, which again is not actually a romance, but it does illustrate the point well. Compatibility requires more work to establish in your story because it's about a deeper connection. So you need to show your readers, how do those characters handle disagreements? Can they compromise? Do they listen to each other even when their emotions are high? They don't always have to be perfect in their emotional intelligence because real people aren't like that. So you don't want to write a too perfect character in a too perfect relationship, but you need to show us that they are not a completely toxic pair or trio or whatever. Do they have a shared sense of humor or worldview? This is not always necessary to have a successful romance in real life, but they need to be compatible enough that people can say they make sense as a couple. Do they support each other's goals? We want to write a healthy relationship in your book, unless you're writing dark romance like I mentioned earlier. So you should have your characters wanting the other to succeed, at least once they start admitting their feelings. Because if you are writing a rivals to lovers or enemies to lovers, they absolutely don't want the other to succeed at first, but eventually they should be supporting each other. And you need to give them comfortable moments alongside passionate ones. If they can't be together in a quiet moment without suddenly turning it into a sexy fest, then you might be writing a relationship that has too much chemistry or not enough compatibility. If your characters only have chemistry, readers aren't necessarily going to believe in the longevity of their relationship to sustain a happily ever after or even a happy for now, which is one of the requirements of a romance novel, like I stated at the top of this video. And if they only have compatibility, it will feel flat compared to other novels that have both the chemistry and compatibility in their story. The best romances show both the immediate chemistry that draws them together, kicks off the story, and the growing compatibility is what makes readers believe they'll last. To test whether or not your romance satisfies these requirements, imagine your couple 10 years in the future. Do they still work, and in what ways? If the answer is they only work if they're able to keep the chemistry at the same level, then you don't have enough compatibility. If the relationship is mundane now and has no spark anymore, then that's also not good. Long-term relationships need more than attraction. They need partnership, but you also don't want to lose the spice of life. Let's talk about subgenres. Each subgenre has specific expectations beyond the two main rules of centering the romance and having a happily ever after or happy for. Contemporary romance has a modern setting and issues, are often faster paced because you have less world building to do, may address current social issues, and readers expect realistic modern relationships. Historical romance. You need to write period appropriate details and be accurate with your historical research. Balance between historical flavor and modern sensibility. Many people, when they pick up a historical romance, don't actually want to read about the mentalities of history because they were not kind to women and also weren't really kind to men showing their feelings either. And you need both to satisfy a modern audience. You need to have social constraints, creating obstacles for your characters, and often a formal courtship compared to contemporary romances. Then you have paranormal romance. Supernatural elements are central to the romance. World building is more intense than contemporary romance because you are inserting magic of some sort. It often involves fated mates or supernatural bonds. Immortality or supernatural danger are often conflicts featured in these stories, and there might be different rules for courtship and relationships, especially if there are fated mates. Readers expect both fantasy elements and romance. And speaking of fantasy, let's talk about fantasy romance, which is different than paranormal romance. Paranormal romance and fantasy romance can often be differentiated based on the creature that the human is in a relationship with. So if you have a vampire, that's probably paranormal, but if you have a fae king, that is normally fantasy romance. Paranormal romance can take place in the real world as long as there are paranormal elements that they are interacting with. But fantasy romance needs to take place in a fantasy world. Again, it can often involve fated mates or supernatural bonds, but it is not the same creatures. And the relationship is often manipulated or part of a magical or political scheme. A lot of epic fantasy plots have in general. Readers expect both fantasy elements and romance. And please note that when people say romantic, they normally expect high fantasy, because if you're writing a romantic urban fantasy, saying fantasy romance can be a little bit misleading to people because they automatically assume it's high fantasy. And then you have romantic suspense. You have external danger threatening the couple. There are thriller and sometimes mystery elements, and the romance and suspense are equally weighted. For a fantasy romance, you don't necessarily need a 50-50 between fantasy and the romance, but here you do. And there's often forced proximity through the danger and life or death stakes. Even though the romance genre centers a romantic relationship, its subgenres dictate the world the relationship plays out, and that means you need to satisfy those genre expectations too. Contemporary readers expect different pacing than a historical reader would. Contemporary can be more direct with both emotions and physical intimacy, but historical romance requires attention to detail and period-appropriate behavior while still creating compelling romantic tension. Paranormal readers expect certain plot elements, and if characters are destined to be together, then the conflict has to come from other sources. Resisting fate, external obstacles, or in terms, if you're writing a fantasy romance, you shouldn't have contemporary problems like competing for a job in the story, unless it's competing for a throne or similar power. And romantic suspense readers want both the mystery and the romance to be substantial. If the romance is just a side benefit to the thriller plot, then that's a thriller with a romantic subplot, which is fine, but is not actually romantic suspense. So know your subgenres expectations. You can subvert them, but you should know what they are first. And while I recommend you read widely in that chosen subgenre, I think you should also read them as the primary genres. For example, if you're writing romantic suspense, read mysteries and thrillers that might not have any romance in them at all. If you write historical romance, if you want to write historical romance, read historical fiction. If you want to write fantasy romance, read epic fantasies. Because if you are only reading in romance subgenre, you might fall into the trap that I have myself earlier on in my writing career, which is to skate by on only doing broad strokes of world building because you are writing a story where the romance is the heart of the novel. Pun intended. A great romance, instead of just an entertaining one, isn't shallow and builds out the world as thoroughly as a non-romance novel. So what conventions do these other genres follow? What do they innovate on, and where is there room for fresh approaches that you could explore? And you need to be honest about which subgenre you're writing. I have said in previous videos on this channel that it's super important to know what genre you're writing, and that is true here as well. Because you don't want to market your historical romance as a suspense because you don't want to market your historical romance as romantic suspense, even if there is suspense in it. And readers are very specific about their subgenre preferences, so mislabeling them will only frustrate them and probably lead to bad reviews. Let's talk about the story structure for a romance. I've already discussed what needs to be at the end, and we've talked about how chemistry kicks off the story. But if you haven't yet read Romancing the Beat by Gwen Hayes, I highly recommend it. Our author Kate Kavanaugh made a video about her following it in order to write her pen name books, and it's like Save the Cat in how it lays out beats to write a story, but it is specifically for the romance genre. I also adore the book on writing romance, but if you haven't read either yet, let me quickly break down the plot points that a romance novel should follow. You have the introduction. It doesn't need to be a meet cute, but it is the hook to the story. It is their first encounter, their first impressions. Fun fact, First Impressions was the original title of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Then you have the attraction and connection. What's the initial spark and what draws them closer to each other? You have barriers and conflict. What's stopping them? Introduction of obstacles that keep the story going and prevent it from ending too early. This is like fun and games in Save the Cat, but you also have growing closer and building the relationship while that is happening. You need to have your characters develop emotional intimacy. You have the dark moment or crisis where the relationship seems doomed. This is akin to the Dark Night of the Soul. And then you have the resolution and commitment. This is them overcoming obstacles and committing to their happy ending. So the exact pacing of this varies by subgenre and length, but these emotional beats should be more or less present. Please note that you can play around with this order a little. I tend to have the barriers and conflict introduced pretty early in my books, sometimes even in advance of the characters meeting, but you obviously can't have the characters growing closer if they haven't met yet and don't have an initial spark. Now, if your story is hate to love or rivals to lovers or enemies to lovers, the initial spark can be an unpleasant one, but it has to be passionate. It's only over the course of the book that it turns from strong dislike or hate to love. And the next video on the show will be all about romance tropes, not just enemies to lovers, so put a pin in that. This outline is much simpler than Save the Cat and is even simpler than what Gwen Hayes lays out in Romancing the Beat, but that's okay because romance readers know the couple are going to end up together. Remember, they're picking up a romance because of that. The question they have and the reason they are picking up romance books rather than just rereading the same one over and over again is because they are wondering how these specific characters overcome their specific obstacles and have their specific relationship work out. You need to make that journey satisfying by hitting all of these emotional beats along the way in ways that feel fresh and true to your characters. Let's talk about heat level. It's not my favorite topic because I think it can very quickly lead into purity, culture, but it is important because many readers will straight up not read a certain book depending on the heat level. A lot of people call the least sexy category sweet or clean, and I don't love that phrasing because sweet implies that anything sexier isn't sweet, which isn't necessarily true, and clean, again, goes back to puritanical culture. I prefer to call no sexiness in a book no spice, and our author Holly Davis does that as well. But whatever you call this level, these romances have no explicit content, kissing only, or fade to black before anything really happens. Then you have sensual. There is implied intimacy, some sensuality, but it's not explicit. You can still have a fade to black moment, but this often goes further than the no spice books, and it can also lead to closed door sexy times. Or it can be open door, but it's not too explicit. Then you have steamy. This is explicit love scenes, but it is not the primary focus of the story. And you have erotic, where it is explicit, frequent, and sexuality is central to the story. This is still not the same as erotica, where you have the erotic level, but maybe the plot falls away from the sex scenes. Your heat level needs to match your genre expectations and target audience. Inspirational romance readers expect no spice content. Paranormal readers often expect steamy or explicit. Contemporary can range across the spectrum, although I haven't really read anything less than explicit lately in contemporary adult romance. A lot of them had illustrated book covers, so it wasn't always clear that's what I was going to get. Luckily, that doesn't bother me at all, but it bothers some readers. And you should note that even though historical romances are often set during time of repressed emotions and repressed sexuality, there is an expectation that the sex scenes in those stories are going to be steamy, if not erotic. Whatever heat level you choose for your story, you need to be consistent. So don't write a no spice romance and then have an explicit scene. Don't promise a steamy story and deliver only fade to black moments. Readers choose books based on heat level preferences, so you need to be consistent. The heat level should also match your characters and your story. If your characters have intense chemistry and the story is building towards their physical relationship, don't then have it resolve in a fade to black moment. And if your story is more focused on the emotional intimacy and the characters are naturally reserved, an explicit scene might feel forced. Most romances require physical intimacy to develop alongside the emotional intimacy, and the progression of this physical relationship should reflect the progression of their emotional relationship, even though that's not always the case in real life. And physical intimacy should reveal character and deepen the relationship, not just provide heat. Sex scenes should show us something about these characters and their connection, not just their physical descriptions. You can read I Give You My Body by Diana Gabaldon, the author of the Outlander series, to learn more about that. To check whether or not your romance is actually a romance and ticking all the boxes I've laid out in this video, let's go through a little checklist. Is the romantic relationship your main plot? Test this by outlining your plot without the romance, and if you still have a complete story, you're not writing a romance novel. And that's okay. Just don't tell your critique partners, alpha readers, beta readers, agents, editors, ARC readers, and eventual customer readers that you write romance, because you'll only set them up for disappointment and piss them off. Do your characters have complete character arcs? You should write down each character's emotional journey and check that they're substantial, and make sure that they require growth at the beginning, have that growth, and then that wherever they end up is earned. You should not have one of the characters waiting for the other to change. Both of them need to be changing. Is your conflict real and earned? Could your conflict be resolved with one honest conversation? If yes, it's not substantial enough for a novel-length romance, and even if you might consider it substantial enough for a shorter form story, it's going to piss off your readers. So don't. Your characters have both chemistry and compatibility. List the evidence of chemistry and the evidence of compatibility, and you want to make sure that they have about the same number of items under them. Does your ending feel emotionally satisfying? Have you resolved the core conflicts? Do readers believe this couple will be happy together? And is there a sense of completion and optimism at the end of your story? Does your heat level match your reader expectations for your subgenre? Research comparable titles in your subgenre and note their heat level. Remember that romance readers are loyal and passionate. They often read multiple books within a week, if not multiple books within a day. And they will continue to do so because they love this genre. So you need to deliver on what they expect, while also bringing your unique voice. And you will then build a devoted readership. But if you violate the core expectations that I've been talking about in this video, you are going to have a problem that even beautiful writing won't save you from. If this video helped you, please consider joining the Inimitable Writing Community's Query Ready course, which guides authors in picking the right genre for their book and understanding expectations. Membership also includes Q&As with me and sometimes special guests like literary agents. Link is in the description down below. In the next video, I'm going to be breaking down some popular romance tropes that can be great when done well or awful and result in a DNF. So be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that. In the meantime, tell me in the comments, what is your favorite romance subgenre to read and or write? And what's the biggest challenge you've faced in writing romance? Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.